1 month ago, Xavier Becerra firmly believed that healthcare is a human right, at least according to his official campaign platform. As recently as May 1st, 2026, any prospective Californian voter, or anyone sadistic enough to follow our state's politics from afar, could have visited his campaign site and read the claim for themselves. But visit the site today and you'll be met with a very different story. Gone is any reference to a universal single-payer system, and the claim that healthcare is a human right has been scrubbed entirely. So what changed? See, Becerra's undulating and non-committal political ideology isn't simply a function of incompetence on his part. When analyzed in conjunction with the timing of several key endorsements and donations, it becomes clear that there are far more sinister forces at play. A deeper analysis of Becerra's 11th hour decision to radically reform his policy proposals at the behest of capital demonstrates how the Democratic Party establishment and liberalism itself necessitate and employ a conservative opposition party in addition to an aesthetic posture toward identity politics and an internal rotating villain structure in order to justify their own existence and supremacy without actually delivering on a progressive populist agenda that could materially improve the lives of the electorate. Just a few short weeks ago, Xavier Becerra's healthcare platform page opened with the following words, quote, "Healthcare is a human right. Californians deserve coverage that they can actually use without medical debts, delays, or fear of losing coverage," end quote. The rest of the page went on to echo this claim, vaguely lauding Becerra's record as a champion of healthcare and even linking to a 1994 clip of the then young Representative Becerra explicitly advocating in favor of a universal single-payer national healthcare system before Congress. That same page today, though, it's unrecognizable. No reference to single-payer universal coverage, no link to the clip of Becerra endorsing it, and not even a commitment to healthcare as a human right. The move comes in the wake of an endorsement and $500,000 donation from the California Medical Association to the Becerra campaign. In a closed-door meeting with Becerra, the president of the CalMed Association reportedly said that, quote, "he is very clearly at this point not in support of single payer," according to an article by KQED. The boost from the CMA, however, is just the tip of the iceberg for Becerra's affiliation with the private care industry. His campaign and affiliated PACs have raked in more than $5 million in lobbying and donations from private care entities, private ambulance services, and big pharma corporations. Amongst these are corporations like DaVita, which has a vested interest in its own monopoly on the dialysis market, as well as Prime Healthcare Services, the fourth largest for-profit health system in the entire nation. Now, for his part, Becerra argues that the majority of this money goes to independent expenditures via PACs over which he personally has no control or authority. Of course, if money is being funneled into entities that exist solely for the purpose of getting you elected, then the question of whether or not that money is going directly to your own personal bank account is really only an argument of semantics. What we ought to be investigating is precisely why these megacorporations are so enamored with Becerra's campaign in the first place. Because the policy proposal and the shift in language can only be understood as the direct result of lobbying on behalf of these groups who themselves are inclined to support the candidate most amicable to their own profiteering adventurism. A candidate like Becerra, who's capable of contorting his own established moral foundation as leverage for the acquisition of more personal political power, is not a true believer in human rights and is not to be trusted. Becerra's vapid campaign demonstrates exactly how the establishment Democratic Party conceals its hollow ideology through unfalsifiable postures when appealing to an imagined disengaged electorate. The former Attorney General's decision to revoke his position on healthcare is not only despicable, but also calls into question the sincerity of his beliefs from the outset. When we inspect Becerra's initial position more deeply, it becomes clear that his transition was not as simple as being supportive of single payer and moving to vehement opposition. Instead, his initial posture retained a non-committal stance that kept him open to lobbying and endorsement from for-profit entities while remaining insulated from pressure coming from a progressive, engaged electorate. Becerra's original healthcare platform was only 9 sentences long. It gave unspecific nods toward his record on the issue and hit buzzwords like built, fought, defended, while laundering his reputation as an experienced public servant without delving into the specifics of his legislative history. After citing the 1994 clip of Becerra praising single healthcare came one of the most devious lines in the platform, where, talking about his vision for the future of California's medical system, Becerra said, quote, "While I believe that universal coverage is possible, I believe we need to pursue immediate wins while building toward a unified system." Not quite as certain terms, if you ask me. But this is the bread and butter philosophy and stump speech of liberal politicians attempting to appeal to their base. It sounds practical and measured. It calls attention to the fact that the structure of our institutions creates significant hurdles to the implementation of radical change without specifically identifying what those hurdles are or who might benefit from their existence. And most importantly, the small wins in the short-term framing intentionally makes the platform feel attainable while simultaneously reducing the scope of what you might have previously considered to be attainable. It creates a problem and then sells you the solution. It implicitly suggests that the power of the system is exponentially more powerful than you could ever hope to be, and then swoops in to provide you with a candidate who can serve as a vessel for your desired political change. It lauds the identity and experience of this candidate, promoting their knowledge in a not so subtle way to convince you to cognitively offload your political participation, transitioning from active participant to passive conformist. It makes you feel engaged without actually being able to articulate the scope of what the platform is offering. Modest tweaks around the margins, whatever that may mean, begin to sound more and more enticing when the only alternative that you're presented with is an uncomfortable status quo that is actively trending worse. But this is a false dichotomy that masks subjugation as agency and convinces you that the change we seek must be modest in scope and time intensive to achieve. It convinces you that you're a participant, not a sheep. That you should support Becerra because he's worked in the field before. He has experience. He's built and fought and defended. But you don't really know what that means, and honestly, you don't care to explore it further. The system is too big, too powerful to understand, so don't look any further. Defer your agency to the candidate. Sit back and let the extent of your political engagement begin and end at the ballot box. Change will come, but you're not engaged enough to really recognize the difference when it doesn't. Elect somebody who will do just enough to say that they helped make the world a better place while simultaneously leaving intact the overarching structures that inherently necessitate another round of elections with identical candidates running on identical policy proposals, all working tirelessly to fight the system, just not too hard. The 9 sentences of Becerra's original healthcare policy platform have since been replaced with a lengthy and overly self-congratulatory breakdown of Becerra's record, in addition to a set of 4 guiding principles and a 12-point policy plan. Notably absent from all of this additional text, however, is still a clear and attainable agenda. Costs will be reduced, waste will be eliminated, oversight will be streamlined, efficiency will be improved, and affordability will be centered in every decision. Paragraphs were added, but there's still no policy plan in sight. It's all perfectly unfalsifiable. And this has become so commonplace in electoral politics that Becerra's campaign wouldn't stand out as particularly egregious were it not for the blatant erasure of his previous stance. Do not, however, mistake the frequency of this phenomenon with its infallibility. The general posture of Becerra's shiny new healthcare platform might appeal to you, but accepting these terms at face value is an unnecessary concession that cedes your own power and agency as a member of the electorate. A candidate with an unfalsifiable policy platform is a candidate who cannot be held accountable for their failures because they're not offering anything that can fail. Alternatively, when a candidate ties their campaign to the promise of articulable policies, the success and legacy of their administration come to be defined by their capacity to deliver on those commitments. A campaign promise is not a guarantee of success, but the candidate who campaigns on the promise of universal single-payer healthcare is significantly more personally invested in the successful implementation of that legislation. By contrast, What does it mean practically to center affordability in every decision? By how much do you aim to cut the cost of prescription drugs? If you don't have a scorecard against which you can grade an administration, then you can't give them an accurate grade. And if our elected officials don't have to worry about the electoral consequences of receiving an accurate grade, then they're not beholden to your interests at all. It's important to note that none of this would be possible without the existence of some other hyper-capitalist, more openly authoritarian party to serve as a foil for the Democrats. Enter the Republican Party. The first and most specific policy proposal in Becerra's new anti-human rights healthcare campaign revolves around the restoration of funds and services soon to be cut from California's healthcare system as a result of the federal administration. This is entirely by design because the impact of these cuts is real and immediate. People all across the country will suffer and, in some cases, even die as a result of these federal cuts, including in California. The logical response to such vile and abject cruelty from the federal administration would be the implementation of a universal policy here at the state level that would ensure no one was ever subject to such cruelty and suffering again. That policy proposal, however, is not profitable. And so, liberalism makes its own calculation. It requires the existence of a Republican Party that is simultaneously both consistently beatable and consistently poses enough of an existential threat so as to warrant ideological concessions out of the electorate. This is the only means through which liberalism can sustain itself, because compared with a single-payer universal system, Xavier Becerra's healthcare policy is a guaranteed loss for the Democratic establishment, absent the threat of some further right consequence capable of scaring the electorate into submission. Focusing on reinstating the losses imposed by the Trump administration is a slam dunk for liberalism. It not only keeps the base focused on the horror and immediacy coming from the right in conservative ideology, but if successfully reinstated, it ensures that we trend no further than restoration of the previous status quo. It's a political win that can be lauded for years to come, but when you break it down, it didn't move the needle any further than getting back to where we were previously. The impact of these cuts is real and imminent. Democrats offer a solution that will be costly, riddled with bureaucracy, and take months or even years to implement. If at the end of all of these battles that are being fought, a Becerra administration still has some amount of time remaining, then perhaps they may pursue some marginal programs that improve slightly the status quo, but those policies are not their primary concern. All the while, you've been made to focus so closely on the threat coming from the right that you don't have time to stop and reflect on why the left consistently wants to move things back center instead of trending further in the opposite direction. Consider it this way. Democrats claim to recognize that there is an existential threat posed to a healthy and functioning society by Trumpism and conservatism. They claim to know that if left unchecked, conservatism will always come back, always demand more cuts and more violence and more death. And yet, despite this claim, they don't dare entertain a leftmost alternative that is actually capable of unseating the stranglehold that conservatism has on political power. This is the exact sentiment expressed by former President Barack Obama, who claims that he wants, quote, a loyal opposition in the form of a Republican Party that is in some ways conservative, or Governor Gavin Newsom, who wants the Democratic Party to trend toward being more culturally normal in a thinly veiled threat on the LGBTQ community. This is the sentiment that led the Kamala Harris campaign to omit any reference to Palestine at the DNC and simultaneously celebrate campaigning with Liz Cheney. This is the same sentiment that always produces just enough dissenting votes amongst Democratic representatives, enabling unpopular conservative legislation to pass the chambers of Congress without pinning the blame on party leadership. This is the same sentiment that produces an autopsy of the 2024 election, yielding no reflection on the party base's demands, and instead baselessly claims that Democrats ought to trend further toward the center. Democrats always want to celebrate the mythical moderate vote. Democrats love Republicans. They show endless patience and grace toward our authoritarian counterparts and are always shocked when the party of racism and thievery turn out to be racist thieves. Because a Republican Party facilitates the need for a liberal alternative. Democrats are always there to swoop in, clean up the mess, and set the stage for another wave of conservative onslaught, gambling with your livelihood and well-being in the process. Republicans, in turn, point to the failures of the status quo that they themselves helped craft as an excuse to convince the electorate that more rampant conservatism must be the answer. Both parties feed on each other in order to survive, at least to a certain extent. What the Democratic Party fails to recognize, however, is that you can only continue this charade for so long before people become engaged enough to reject it out of principle or desperate enough to reject it out of necessity. Generations of a two-party system have plunged this country into a conservative wasteland. Each Democratic administration seeks only to restore the previous status quo, while each Republican one seeks to trend further conservative, so the net effect is a more conservative status quo. With Trump, we reach the endgame of this duopoly. The Republican Party is outright, unabashedly fascist at this point. They don't seek to disguise themselves, so they no longer need a Democratic foil in order to subsist. This leaves the Democrats in a sort of lame duck period where they have to try and emulate old talking points that don't resonate with the base and continue to do everything in their power to quell the growing left flank movement that is actively eroding their own base of support. This is typically the point where diehard Hillary defender liberals will jump in and say, so Democrats aren't any better than Republicans? And no, of course they are. But only if you assume that the definition of better is being further ideologically left than your opposition. And so by that very same metric, I would ask, aren't leftists any better than the Democratic establishment? See, if we agree that the Affordable Care Act is better than a fully corporatized private healthcare hellscape, I fail to see how a universal healthcare policy is not also better than the ACA. And so we arrive at a candidate like Xavier Becerra, who is more preoccupied with ensuring the entrenchment of the corporate status quo than actually delivering on a progressive, articulable agenda. Becerra retains a posture on most issues that is vague at best and transparently conservative at worst. In a sit-down interview with CNN earlier this week, he literally failed to reference one single policy proposal that he would enact in order to bring down the cost of living in the state of California. Nevertheless, his largely hollow campaign is riding the coattails of his experience as Attorney General and a wave of large dollar corporate donations into prominence in the polls. But with respect to his record as AG, I would argue it bears consideration whether his years litigating the ins and outs of loopholes exploited by the very same corporations who now bankroll his own campaign is really the vote of confidence for the public that he thinks it is. As far as the rest of Becerra's platform goes, it speaks for itself. And by that I mean, it doesn't speak at all. Xavier Becerra may be an apt representation of the status quo, but he is far from benign. Changing one's policy proposals in response to being presented with a stronger, more progressive alternative is commendable. But rewriting your own healthcare policy to align with the agenda of a private lobby that has a vested interest in the success of your own campaign is deeply undemocratic. And keep in mind that the powers that be who guided this rewrite of the Becerra campaign platform, they didn't stop at the policy proposal. A conscious decision was made to strike from the platform the words "healthcare is a human right." Consider for a moment what it means that those words were deemed incompatible with the interests of one of the largest healthcare entities in the nation. Consider also what it means that Becerra, a candidate for executive office, did not draw a hard line at defending that position which he claims to have previously held. The institutional rot in this nation runs deep. We need not make it any worse by electing an unprincipled corporate puppet.